Okay, so this is section 5 of the PCNSE course. Getting more and more into it now, and this particular one is talking about panorama management. Okay, it's not as big a part of the exam as potentially I think it should be, because a lot of people use panorama. So I would always suggest that you do some more research into it, and as I make reference to in the videos, I am looking to get my own panorama instance, and then we'll be able to do more in-depth videos and tutorials on panorama. What I don't want to do is just start grabbing other people's material and trying to put it together and pass it off as my own. So I really need my own instance. So the top and bottom of what you'll need to know is what panorama is. It's a management and centralized login tool for panorama firewalls, and it can manage the cloud stuff as well, and VMs and so on. What it can be configured to do, so it can either be in legacy mode, I believe it's called, where it's panorama management and logging. You can have it in panorama only, where you can manage dedicated log collectors, and you can manage panorama instances as well. So you can have panorama that manages panoramas, and it can also be in log collector only. So it's only a centralized log collector, and that's when you manage it from panorama. A good understanding of templates and template stacks, which aren't, well, they weren't for me anyway, they might be for you, but they weren't immediately obvious to me. And then committing changes with panorama. So basically, how do you go about committing the changes, and what does that mean? Okay, so what is panorama? So without panorama, Palo Alto firewalls have no way of controlling each other or have any knowledge of each other without panorama to manage them. Panorama provides a centralized location for monitoring, management of Palo Alto clusters, appliances, and wildfire appliances, as well as centralized policy management, increasing operational efficiency across distributed firewall networks. What I mean by that is that because you've got that one, without it, you would, because there is no knowledge shared between Palo Alto firewalls by default, there is natively, sorry, you would have to manage each one separately. So of course with panorama, you can create the configuration, and this is where we get the zero touch deployment from. You can create the configuration on the panorama, and as long as you have got the IP address of the panorama and the serial number of the firewall and the serial number of the firewall, serial number of the firewall and the serial number of panorama, and you've put them in their respective boxes. So panorama is expecting this serial number to appear with it, and the other one, the firewall, knows where to find panorama and what panorama it is. You can then send that box off to wherever you want to, and the least technical of people can plug it in. It will fire itself up. It will get an IP address, obviously from DHCP from the ISP, and then it will go and it will find panorama and it will log itself on and then pull all its config down from panorama. So you can see how that literally stops. I mean, I remember back in the day, I used to do sort of half-day contracts with people where they'd had a firewall shipped to a site where it was non-technical staff only, and they'd pay me half a day's rate, sometimes a day rate for traveling as well. And you'd turn up and you'd basically just plug it in and put a text file on it that had been sent to you. So you can see how that obviously saves you money immediately. Not only that, but you've got centralized license management. So you can license firewalls from there. You've got your license status, subscription statuses for all your devices that are managed. And that is, I'm sure you can see, would certainly stop any surprises as you go forward. Okay, so looking at panorama, we can see that it basically looks the same. You have two new objects here, which is actually four, sorry. So you've got device groups, and templates that you can click into, but obviously that is specifically for managing your multiple firewalls through Panorama. Policies is policies. That's same as anything else. So it's your security, your NAT, QoS, PBF, and so on. Objects is objects. Again, the same. Then your network configuration looks the same, but obviously it's bound to different groups and firewalls. And then your device configuration is your device configurations per template stack. So if you're configuring, say, DNS for a specific area, for a global area, then you would use this. And then finally, to get to the Panorama itself configuration is there. And as you can see, as you go through the whole thing, really it just looks the same. You have the same thing here. You have the widgets, ACC, all looks the same. It's just now you are looking at across your entire estate as opposed to looking at just one firewall. And really, it makes everything just that little bit more intuitive and that little bit easier to work with, because basically you're not having to learn. Okay, so now that we've seen that the GUI and the representation of policies on Panorama is almost virtually identical, except for a couple of differences, minor differences, I think, between that and the firewall. So if you're familiar with the firewall graphic user interface, then you're going to be familiar with Panorama, and it's not going to seem massively different for you, or a huge learning curve, which is certainly something that isn't necessarily the same with other vendors. So templates and template stacks are really the building blocks of the main reason that Panorama is so efficient at managing the firewalls and allowing you to create huge distributed networks that are very secure and are enforcing a consolidated security policy, company security policy across them all with ease, and incorporating any use case differences or location differences without giving any hassle or headaches to the IT staff. Okay, so templates, you can create a template as we saw before. You got the device context and you've got the network. So you got device and network, and then you've got objects. When you create a template stack, what you're basically saying is, okay, I have a broad range of global settings that I want at the top that are going to be broadly the same for all managed devices. And then as I go further down the stack, or the higher level as it is in stacks, so as we get closer and closer to the specific device configuration, any duplicate values are then overwritten by the one above it. So you can start with a very broad, this is our global stance, and then you move closer and closer to the differences and specific configurations that need to be done on different device groups, which you'll always find, because it's as you move globally, there's time differences, there's location differences, there's different laws that have to be adhered to. So if you've got decryption rules in one place, for instance, that may be illegal to decrypt that traffic or not decrypt that traffic if you then move into a different legal space. So obviously, one of the things that comes to mind is, well, if I've then got to create templates and template stacks in order to create all these, then surely I'm not really saving that much time, because I have to then go in and I have to add different values for the different firewalls. The templates and template stacks, they can call upon a CSV file, and that CSV file has a number of variables that the firewall understands, and that Panorama understands, and a number of variable names. So as opposed to putting in, say, for your inside interface, now your inside interface, okay, it could be the same everywhere, I suppose, but it's more than likely not going to be. And for the sake of my sanity and this example, it's not going to be. However, your zone would be. So if you want to call all your inside zones trust, then you would create your template stack with your at the top, or the global one would have a trust zone and an untrust zone, for instance, and that's fine. That's just how that stays. But then for your inside interface, basically pulled on the stack on the template name, you would have a variable for inside IP, and then the firewall, when pushing that, or Panorama when pushing that, would read the CSV file. It would see the value, the key, which is inside interface, and it would see the value for that file, and it would replace that placeholder with the actual value. Okay, and as I said, they allow the creation of very broad configurations that are wide in scope all the way through, and then by order of preference will inherit to a granular level, but it will so when I say inherit, it'll inherit the broad level. Anything that doesn't change going down that stack of 8, because the most templates you can have in a stack is 8. As you get down to the bottom, it doesn't inherit any changed value. So you couldn't have the global value won't override the one at the bottom. Okay, so here we're going to start clicking into the network and device templates, so we can see how these are built up into template stacks and how that's then passed down. Okay, so if we look here, we can see, so if I go for, let's say, so a list of templates at the top here, and then you'll see that these figure in template stacks at the bottom. So if we look at Stack Hub 20 Demo 2, so it's got those 3 templates in it. They will appear up here, and then they're just put into the stack at the bottom, and we can look at the stack, and we can see that the stack has got the Ethernet interfaces configured. We can see that we're using variables by the fact it's got the $sign there. Have our VLANs, none there. Loopback interfaces, there's loopbacks, tunnels, and then we saw an SD-WAN template in there as well, so we can see that template. Okay, so that's the network templates. Now the device templates, again, you can see that you've got the same as we had before. So this is configuring the, obviously as you deploy firewalls in different geographic locations or for different use cases, they may very well have differences in login banners, or you may want to look at different timeouts, certainly the geolocation. And this is where this allows you then to create your template for your geographic or use case configurations. And it's the same. There's not much really to say. It's literally designed specifically so as you're going through it and as you're configuring it, you're not having to look at anything new. The only concept you're having to get round is the fact that now you're creating templates that are pushed to device groups. Okay, so if we then want to look at how we then create the templates and the template stacks, let's go to Panorama, templates, and here we can see that we have all of our templates, and we've got the variables here that you can see. That was a bad choice. There, so we have a variable there. So we have our loopback 20, and then it will pick up the variable and it'll appear on here. Okay, and then as we move down to our our stacks. So we take this one here, our Hub 20. We can see that we have demo single sign-on, which is here, the one that we picked before. Auth with local user, and then the Hub 20 SD-WAN. Okay, and then this is the group that it's being pushed to. So if we click into the stack and create the stack, we can add a template to the stack. And with that template in there, you just literally wouldn't, but so as you can see at the bottom, it says the template at the top of the stack has the highest priority in the presence of overlapping config. So your global values will go at the bottom, and then as you get further and further along, anything that is in here that is then overwritten by this will be honored, but then anything that is in here that is overwritten by that will then be honored. Whereas if you get right down to what you want for that specific set of firewalls, place that one at the top, and then that's how you'll go. You'll go global and then more granular. Now, I can't push policy to this because it's just a demo, so I'll remove that. Okay, so we can see a description for it. It's a default vsys. The group that we want to place it in, so we can select our groups if you wanted to create another group. Okay, so it was network and device templates. So now we have the concept of pre-rules and post-rules. And I say by no means this list is exhaustive of the functionality and the value of Panorama. This is purely and simply using the PCNSE study guide published by Palo Alto to show what is required for the PCNSE course. Okay, so once far as we moved under management in Panorama, there is this concept of pre and post rules. Pre and post rules are the way you control the amount of control that a local administrator has over the rule base. So rule bases are evaluated as always from top to bottom. So it would make sense then logically that pre-rules are evaluated first and are at the top of the rule base. Post rules are at the end of the rule base and they have the final say on traffic as it leaves the firewall. And then local firewalls that are under control of local file admins are marked in white in between the two. So when we look at the rule base in a minute, and you'll see that you have orange shaded rules, and then there'll be a line of white rules in between those, and that is your demarcation point between the pre-rules and the post-rules. At the end of that, obviously, you have the default rules, default rules, the intrazone and the interzone rules, and they are under the control of Panorama, and that's what makes the security policy part unique amongst all of them, because that is the only one that actually has the pre, post, and default rule editing capability. So as policies can be put out to different device groups, they will it would follow they'd have potentially different roles in organization. So you have to look at the pre and post rule use cases. Now, best practice tends to suggest that you would do this in alignment with the company stance and then the level at which you need that ability to react quickly or to add or remove rules, or the sheer amount of autonomy you have at different sites as to who can make changes on the firewalls is then going to make it. That's going to decide where you have your majority of your rules. Do you have them in pre or do you have them in post? Because rules pushed from Panorama are not editable on the firewall locally, so when using the pre-rules, that control can then not be superseded, because if you block something there, then it can't be changed. So that can't be changed locally. So if you block something there that they then need, with all the best will in the world, they then can't change that. Okay, so when you're in an environment that is managed mainly by Panorama, you should use the pre-rules, as you don't really need to pass that ability to change rules, that editability, onto your local admins. However, if you're in a situation where let's say you've got a strong IT IT group at a particular location. They have situations where they're running, I don't know, let's say for instance they have a lot of developers working there and they need to be able to make quick on the fly changes, or they have a very dynamic environment that needs changing a lot, then you would tend to go for post rules where you want to have the final say on the traffic. Really, you want to be able to say, okay, well, this is blocked, or this has got to be allowed, or so on. That sort of, there is obviously the argument on the other side of that. I appreciate that, where you'd say, well, okay, if we've got post rules, then what value actually are post rules when all's said and done? Because any administrator worth their salt will be able to look at the post rules and then supersede that back in the locally managed rules. And that's something we'll get into further down the line when we start looking at rule-based optimization and security best practices. But for now, that is the best practice. That's what it says. And that's what I shall pass on to you. Okay, so let's start talking about pre and post rules and what they actually mean. So the use cases essentially are that once you've onboarded a firewall onto Panorama, you then want to control that with pre and post rules. So the idea being that in the post rules, the pre-rule section, that if you have something that absolutely has to be enforced, then you have to put it in the pre-rule section, basically. So this is going to sit at the top of the firewall rule base. It's going to sit at the top of the firewall base on the local firewall as well, and can't be edited by the local administrators. As you can see, it's read-only in this one particularly, but you can. This shows that it's from Panorama, and there will be another gear icon if it is overridable, but in this particular instance, it's not going to be. Okay, so basically the hierarchy is this. I'll show you. Okay, so we have pre-policy rules at the top of the rule base, local policy rules, which will be in white. So on the firewalls, it will be shaded this way as well. And those are the ones that local administrators can make, and provide some flexibility that way. And then you have the post policy rules, which are like, if you like, the last say. And then you have the standard default rules. So with the idea being, so the use cases are, because you'll need to know like the sort of the use cases as you go through. So the use cases being, if you have a very secure environment and you have some remote offices that don't really have much in the way of IT staff or something, you would tend to then stick towards pre-rules. This meaning that all the administration is pretty much done by Panorama and by the administrators that are running Panorama, and there's very little in the way of activity locally. If you have IT staff that need to make changes and there's regular changes being made to the local firewalls, then you'd probably be quite heavy on post rules, because with the post rules, you're basically just having you are having the last say within the rule base, and you're allowing a lot more flexibility for local administrators. And then default rules are default rules. So we can preview the rules. So as we preview the rules, we can see the rule base as it will appear on the box. This is how it will appear there. So we have our pre-rules here. We have our local rule in white, as we said before, and then we have our post-policy rules there. And again, so if we just do this for validation's sake, so let's say, so our first rule on our post-policy rules is the JP3 demo. So if we just show our post rules there, so we can see that the first rule is that. Okay, so then UK2 demo, I know for a fact that that is the device group is at, and the firewalls are there. So we can go on to that device context. And then once we get to the device context, so the device context, remember, if we're switching to device context, means we're switching actually to the firewall itself. And so once we're on the firewall, we can see that again, it makes sense. So we have our rule there. As we go down, we can see the pre-rules and the post-rules within this rule base. So if we just pop back to Panorama, just take its time to switch back. Okay, and here we can see then essentially that you have the only one that's any different is the security policies, because they have the default rules as well. But the others you can define pre and post rules for NAT, QoS, PBF, decryption, tunnel inspection, application override. You can basically have pre and post rules for any kind of configuration that you want to do within the policies, and it's important because that allows you to give that sense of a boundary between global administration through Panorama and local administration, allowing fast reaction times or something like that from local IT staff who need to solve a problem potentially there and then on the spot, and without having to contact whoever's running Panorama, basically. So those are all there. The preview rules is there. Again, the same thing works. So you can highlight unused rules, and then you can see unused rules there. They're the ones that are shaded in. Okay, we can drop them. We can use the same, so the policy optimizer, there's no new apps. See the unused in 30 days, obviously you can see all these are on 0, but they all work exactly the same. And that's the rule base. That's the concept of the pre and post rules. Is they are pre the local rules and post the local rules, and that's the entire complication of it all. Okay. Okay. So now we need to talk about device groups. And device groups are very much along the same lines as the pre-rules and post-rules and so on. So device groups are a way of logically separating rule bases, configurations, and everything within sort of a templated hierarchy. So you start off with shared. So everything that's in shared, when you create a device group, everything inherits from shared. Okay? And then underneath we can see that demo is then nested underneath. And then we have the demo device groups underneath that. Okay, in this particular instance, we've got UK 1, 2, and 3 demo, and then they've got devices, virtual systems attached to them. Okay, now as you come back out of that, you then create another cluster, but everything is always nested under shared. So when you create the device groups, it inherits the configuration from top to bottom. Again, as it becomes closer to the bottom, it's the more specific it becomes. So you would configure the shared settings that are global. Again, it's all logical really. So you got the global settings at the top, and then as you get sort of further down into location specific settings, as you get down to here, so you're up here, for instance, you would have the domain. If you stretch across the domain, you'd have all your basic security policies, say SSH timeouts, admin groups, that type of thing. And then as you come down here, you then pick up your different IP addresses and location specific attributes such as, for instance, time zones and things like this. And then without that, you would have to configure all the function-specific and location-specific settings manually each time. And that would just be, well, it'd be terrible. So you've got managed devices. Summary, this shows us all the managed devices and where they're up to. And you can see here that we've got some that are in sync, some that aren't. So pushed version 2.3.1, and that's template push version 2.3.5. So we know that that's in sync with the Panorama at the minute, meaning they've both got the same version of configuration on them. So Panorama has the same version of configuration as the Firewall. That's where we talk briefly about the committing. So in a situation where you've got out of sync, for instance, if you've made changes and you commit it simply to Panorama, then the Panorama version of the configuration for this device is going to be different to the version that is on the box. If you commit and push, then that will be in sync. If somebody is just committed to Panorama and then you want at a later date to bring it in sync, you would then push to the devices, and then you can push the committed changes that have already been committed to the devices. And of course, as you do that, I don't have permission to do it, as you can see, because it's read-only, so I can't really demonstrate that. But that's it. So that's device groups as well. As I say, the important thing really to think about Panorama is it's an orchestration tool as much as anything else. Plus, it's the central point for a lot of things, like your login and things like this. I mean, you can run Panorama in varying modes. You can run it in just standard Panorama, which is logging and management. Logging only, management only, and in management only it can control log collectors. I strongly suggest that you go along and read up about it. And as I managed to get further into this and managed to get my own Panorama instance to work with, then we will look at it further. Because I really, really appreciate the way Panorama flows logically the same as the Firewall, and I think that is in stark contrast to some of the competing vendors, let's say. Okay, so that was the pre and post rules, and I hope that makes a bit more sense. So I have the committing changes in Panorama. So part of the PCNSE, one of the sections is committing changes and understanding how that is actually done and the potential pitfalls. Because committing changes in Panorama can be done either to Panorama only, as you can see, or Panorama and then push the devices. So you commit the change to the Panorama for that device group or that device, and then that pushes the config directly straight down to the firewalls. Or you can just push committed configurations on Panorama to device groups. So if you're to be using the first option here, so where you commit only to Panorama, and then somebody was to come along and just do a push to devices, then they would potentially push the changes that you had put in. So if you're working on this and you'd have to take a commit log if you wanted to make sure nobody pushed anything, but it is always best practice as well to have a look and see what's actually being pushed, and only push a local admin. So only push your local changes that you're making rather than pushing everybody's changes. Because if you push just committed configurations, that will then push everything. So all the other options remain. The push scope, as I say, whose changes you're pushing, the preview, etc. All that remains exactly as it was before, and as well as the auditing comments and so on, all there as would be. So the next thing I'm going to look at is device contexts. Okay, and so that's it for Panorama. I say although ironically, it's far from it from Panorama. And when you start looking at the plugins you can get, for ACI Fabric plugins, so that you can dynamically retrieve endpoint groups, and those endpoint groups, as they are, as systems come up in them and go down them, stuff like that, that then can be added to dynamic groups and so on. It really is no, it's not a limitless. I do wax lyrical sometimes about Palo Alto, but it's not a limitless platform. But it really is. There's so much more to it than is in the PCNSE. And I think what I'd like to do, and I probably will do, is do a separate course just specifically on Panorama, because it's one of the few orchestration tools and management tools for security vendors that actually makes sense and actually works how it says it does. And that's not to bring anybody else down. It's just, I think the way that they've approached it is so much better than some others. It's not a device to control disparate devices. It's a consolidation of an already existing management profile and platform that just is enabling then the management of many devices. So one thing I really like to try and push at the minute is, if people could like the video, if you don't want to subscribe, then that's fine with me. I'm not sure, but if you like it, at least then YouTube knows that people are liking the video, so that would be really appreciated. And that's it, and I'll see you over for section 6 as that comes up.